So, Lone Rider here, and I want to talk about what's probably the best sci-fi show you've never heard of, and that is Space Above and Beyond. Now, this was on the air in the year 1995 for a little less than one glorious season, but in that time it gave us some awesome stories, some really interesting characters, and it's been sorely missed. The show told the story of the 58th, a group of Marines fighting in space against an alien species that had just flat out massacred a colony and essentially started a war. The show, I mean, for lack of a better way to describe it, it was kind of like a World War II movie in space, and you know, to this day, it's one of my favorite programs. And the CGI and whatever it looks a little dated. They didn't have widescreens back then, so I don't think they ever expected that this would be viewed, the way it is. But the show was really good on many levels. There's been a lot of criticisms leveled at the fact that the main characters were not only pilots but also took place in ground assaults. However, that may not be accurate for actual military troops. But I think that in the context of the show, it actually made sense because it allowed them to tell both types of stories with the same cast of characters that we'd become invested in without changing them out. And you don't know what a war in space would be like, right? I mean, I don't. Maybe personnel would be so limited that you would have to have people take on dual roles. Speaking of people, it wasn't just the main cast of characters that was interesting. Each of them was there for their own reasons. But the supporting cast, the boss, his boss, the background characters, etc. Many of whom went on to be in other shows. The guy who played Colonel McQueen was on 24. He was in an episode of Millennium. The guy who played Commodore Ross was the sheriff in the X-Files episode Home. The one with the Peacock family, real creepy. And then there's Kristen Cloak, who played Lieutenant Shane Vance, and she went on to, well, Final Destination. Need I say more? She was also in an X-Files episode that seemed to be based on the incident in Jonestown with the cultists, where she played a very, very creepy character who was very different from her character in Space Above and Beyond. But this was a show that I think did everything right, and one of the things it did right is it didn't try to be any more than it was, which is basically a war drama set in outer space. The shows like Star Trek, they have a whole social structure created within them that really isn't believable because they've glossed over how it's accomplished. This show didn't give us polished, gloss, gleaming, Star Trek bulkheads. They gave us the exposed rivets and the greasy conduits hanging from the ceiling, not just in terms of the sets and the overall aesthetic and look of the spaceships and the show, but in terms of the world in which it was set. This was a world very much like our own, with hatreds and vendettas and biases and all sorts of problems, social and personal, that we have today. Contrast that with the whitewashed world of Star Trek, right? And it's interesting that up until this point, for most people, including myself, the only real experience we had with sci-fi, hardcore sci-fi, outer space sci-fi, was basically, the presentation that you get in shows like Star Trek or movies like Star Trek, where you have this sort of big, grandiose, wonderful society where everything is shiny and new and works, and it's like, okay, but how do we get there? What's that missing step? Because I don't like that. Doesn't seem like the world that I live in, and they never really do a great job of showing how we got there. So there's always like a believability gap for that for me. I like Star Trek, don't get me wrong, but there's always that believability gap. In this show, again, you get the raw exposed metal skeleton. You see the rivets, you see the grease, you see where they patch the bullet holes, in more ways than one. and it just seems a little more believable, as a reviewer at the time wrote, a gritty version of the future. They also touched on issues that were relevant, obviously, in the 1990s and are still relevant today. Issues of loyalty, issues of bias, issues of revenge, the the question of what a leader owes the people under his command. What do the people under his command owe the leader? The the issue of prisoners of war and their treatment and torture and one episode actually dealt directly with the guilt that a former POW had over things that he was forced to say and statements he was forced to make when he was being tortured by the enemy. These weren't always light, cherry, happy topics, but the thing is, they always faced them head on, and they always faced them standing tall, and it really was a good show. It really, the end of every episode. Let me put it this way: I didn't feel like cheering, but I had a smile on my face because no matter how dark and scary things got, there was always somebody there who had somebody else's back. There was always somebody there who had a sense of decency and a sense of loyalty. There was always a team, and it was a really good show, and it's sorely missed. And you might wonder, well, why didn't this? If this was so good, why didn't it stay on the air? Basically, it cost a lot more to make than most of the other shows on the air at the time, and it wasn't making any more money. It is kind of sad. I mean, there are literally bits and pieces of this, shining moment in the history of sci-fi, scattered around the globe, rusting away. A full-size SA-43 space fighter mock-up, like sitting, rusting in a barn somewhere or whatever. To me, the lasting impression that the show left isn't a prop plane moldering away in a field somewhere, but it's in the minds and the hearts of the viewers. And you know, so just if you want to see it, enjoy it for what it is. Sort of a little bit of history frozen in time, and a show that at the time was pretty damn good, and I would argue still is. Yeah. Um, so go get your hands on Space Above and Beyond, the coolest sci-fi show that you've never heard of.